Welcome to Coming Home, Survive and Thrive in Homeschooling. I'm Christine and I have a special treat in store for you today. C.S. Lewis holds an important role in many homeschooling families, from his incredibly popular Narnia series to the classic Mere Christianity. There is more from his genius mind, such as the Space Trilogy, The Great Divorce, and The Abolition of Man, and that's just for starters. It was a privilege to speak with Dr. Michael Ward, one of the top scholars in C.S. Lewis in the world. Dr. Ward is in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford, UK, and a Professor of Apologetics at Houston Christian University, Texas, USA. I wanted to know how Michael would advise home educators to incorporate the Narnia books in a curriculum beyond the reading, written narration, and perhaps followed by watching the movies. He didn't disappoint. There is a mysterious connection between the Chronicles that Dr. Ward stumbled onto, explored deeply, and in time presented his findings to the literary world. His book, Planet Narnia, is the result of his research. In it, you will find almost everything you need to form an entire curriculum. I say almost because you'll still have to supply the maths portion, although there is arithmetic to be found as you study the planets. You have science and the scientists, including astrology and astronomy, classical and medieval studies, history, and as much scope for poetry and written narration as you want. Michael also includes advice on using Mere Christianity and the Abolition of Man, along with his commentary After Humanity, for your older children and adults. I wish I had these available to me when we were homeschooling. Thank you, Dr. Michael Ward, for agreeing to come on and talk to us on my podcast on homeschooling. Very excited to hear how you're going to put Lewis through the lens of a homeschooling family. Thank you.
My pleasure, Christine. Thank you for having me.
So to kick off, Michael, I know that you are probably one of the best scholars in the world when it comes to Lewis and his books and the research that you've done. For today, I'm especially interested in how to explore the Narnia series. It is such a staple in home educating families. They're very good just to read by themselves, and that should be the first thing that a family does. But then reading your Planet Narnia after that and realizing that there is the ripple effect going out of those books is significant, and there's so much that could be picked up according to a child's ability and carried on with. So to kick off then, Narnia is a good set of stories, but why are they important? Why should we be including them in a homeschool curriculum?
Well, a variety of reasons. One is purely the teaching of English literature and literary criticism, how to enjoy a story, how to appreciate a story, how to interpret a story. Then from the more sort of scriptural or theological or explicitly Christian point of view, there's a good deal of Christian theology in the stories and lots of biblical allusions and connotations, and those can be teased out. And that is a sort of transferable skill to the reading of allegorical literature generally, including allegorical parts of the Bible, like the reading of the parables, learning to distinguish between the vehicle and the tenor of a story. That's an important thing to be brought out. From a more sort of philosophical or moral or ethical point of view, there's a lot in the stories of the Narnia series about right and wrong, good and evil, and how different characters learn lessons and change. So there's a good deal of sort of stuff about psychology and development, maturation. And then finally, if you really want to do a deep dive into the Narnia Chronicles, then you can get into what I believe is the sort of the DNA, the imaginative substructure of the stories, which has to do with, of all things, medieval cosmology. As I argue in Planet Narnia, there are 7 chronicles because there were 7 medieval heavens or 7 planets, 7 spheres, which C.S. Lewis, being a medieval scholar, knew all about and loved and admired and described as spiritual symbols of permanent value, which were especially worthwhile in his own generation. And it's from these 7 spiritual symbols that he proceeds to construct each of the Narnia stories in turn, which helps explain, by the way, why they are so different from each other in tone and flavor, and also helps explain a great number of little ornamental, incidental details, which otherwise might be rather puzzling. So anyway, those are some of the things that you can get out of Narnia, teaching them to a variety of ages as well. That's a great thing about them too, that you can start with children as young as, I don't know, 6 or 7 maybe, especially with the first book, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and continue teaching them ever afterwards, however old your students are. I mean, I now teach the Chronicles here at university level. My undergraduate students, and indeed my graduate students, my doctoral students, are immersing themselves in Narnia continually. They're just fantastic sources of wisdom and insight and beauty and narrative art, and they're works of genius, if you ask me.
They're like treasure chests. You just don't realize what's in there until you start really fossicking around and getting down even below that top layer of the beauty of it, what's down underneath. So according to the child's age, so under the age of, maybe 9 or 10, the child is a little bit more concrete in their thinking. But there's so many more subjects that could be incorporated, because what I'm thinking of is that potentially a homeschooling family can take, let's go with the Chronicles, and they could, apart from maths, create an entire body of work for at least a term, if not more, and only just touch the surface. So obviously there's astrology and astronomy, and the sciences are with that. So that's one area they could probably do with some ideas for what books, etc., to go to. Then there would be the sciences. We talk about the metals that are identified to the different planets, why those, the effect of them all. Classics, Lewis constantly referring to philosophers and poetry and medieval stories. And then the history component of it too, just the fact that it's coming out of the medieval time. There was a whole culture in the way that they lived then. And you can get all of that out of just working with the Narnia series. And then, of course, they can have their written compositions and maybe memorization work with some poetry as well. So, and plus Shakespeare and Socrates, it's just so much to choose from.
Fishing off my shelf, a book published in the United Kingdom a few years ago, and it's called Teaching Narnia, and it's by Olivia Warburton, and I wrote the foreword. So, that's a good little primer, as it were, to things you can get out of Narnia. I mean, it's a good book, but it's not necessarily exhaustive. There are plenty of other things that you could get out of Narnia that she doesn't cover.
But it would certainly help not have to reinvent the wheel of everything. Michael, are you familiar with the Charlotte Mason approach to education?
No.
No. Charlotte Mason was a turn of the 19th, 20th century educationalist. She came from up the Lake Districts, and her philosophy included the attitude of taking whole and living books and taking that as the foundational curriculum that you would teach a child, and just believing that children are persons and that the world is your classroom, that kind of thing, rather than boring textbooks that you could teach a child through the Narnia book. She would have been well and truly approving of.
Yeah, well, one thing that occurs to me is, as we're talking about homeschooling, there are themes about education within the Narnia Chronicles and what it is to read and learn, and why one should want to read and learn. I think that comes through most strongly in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, particularly through the character of Eustace Barrett Scrub, who's had a very bad education. He's read all the wrong books, or at least he's read none of the right books, and so he doesn't know, for instance, what dragons are. He just likes books of information, especially if they're books about fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools and with pictures of grain elevators and beetles pinned on cards and things. It's a great satire from Lewis on a certain kind of soulless and mechanistic drudgery type of education, the sort of thing you get with Mr. Gradgrind in Charles Dickens. But there's also, more seriously, a theme coming through The Voyage of the Dawn Treader about liberal education, free education. We're not talking about conservative and liberal here. It's not a political term. It's a term about the free inquiry that should characterize the best kind of learning, that you don't look at the life of learning simply for what you can get out of it, but because it's a good thing in itself. It's the difference between vocational training and liberal education, that you don't seek it for any particular purpose other than the good thing it is in its own right. And the reason I say that's particularly strong in the Dawn Treader, if you'll just sit with me for a moment as I unpack this thought, because it connects very much, as it happens, to this scheme of the seven heavens. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is constructed out of the imagery of the sun. The sun was regarded as one of the seven heavens in the medieval cosmos. And as Lewis explains in his book, The Discarded Image, the sun, or Sol, as he was also known, makes men wise and liberal. And liberal is, incidentally, a word that Lewis explores in minute detail in his book, Studies in Words. Free study seeks nothing beyond itself and desires the activity of knowing for that activity's own sake. That's what the man of radically servile character, give him what fortune at leisure you please, will never understand. He will ask, but what use is it? There's a very utilitarian mindset behind that kind of illiberal education. What's the point? Show me the money, as it were. But it's interesting that Lewis says that the servile person asks, what use is it? And then in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is the Sun book, you get that very interesting episode when the ship is going into the dark island, this sort of amorphous blackness. And Caspian, the king, asks, do we go into this? Not by my advice, said Drinian, who's the captain. And then Reepicheep, the mouse, breaks in and says, why not? Will someone explain to me why not? No one was anxious to explain. So Reepicheep continued, if I were addressing peasants or slaves, he said, I might suppose that this suggestion proceeded from cowardice. But I hope it will never be told in Narnia that a company of noble and royal persons in the flower of their age turned tail because they were afraid of the dark. But what manner of use would it be, ploughing through that blackness? Asked Drinian. Use? Replied Reepicheep. Use, captain? If by use you mean filling our bellies or our purses, I confess it will be no use at all. So far as I know, we did not set sail to look for things useful, but to seek honour and adventure. And here is as great an adventure as ever I heard of. And here, if we turn back, no little impeachment of all our honours.
I love it.
So that's a classic example of the liberal educational philosophy as expounded by Reepicheep, and the servile philosophy as represented by the captain Drinian, who wants to know what's the use of it. And it's all part and parcel of the solar imagery which drenches the Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
Because knowledge should be really, because it comes from our ability created in God's image to be creative and knowledgeable. So therefore, by definition, it should be a hard work, but a pleasure. It should develop you and make you blossom and think of other things that you never would have, which is one of the goals of home educating, especially through the Charlotte Mason, is because it doesn't give the child an opportunity to become bored with a dry, unnecessary text. But because if you think of a child preschool, how alive and just naturally curious in the sense of wow for everything, to keep that, capture it, build on it, that's the goal. And I think Lewis understands that. He trusts the child's ability to be able to interpret what he's writing about, and he believes they can because he wrote this amazing series.
Absolutely, 1,000 times yes. There's so much wonder embedded in the Narnia Chronicles. And wonder is a really important motive for study and inquiry and just living one's life. It's very Chestertonian, isn't it? Chesterton was always the great exponent of wonder. And what is the point of wondering? There is no point. It's good in its own right. The very fact that I want to ask that question, what's the point of wondering, reveals how very utilitarian we all tend to be. We want the payoff, but the whole point is that there need be no payoff. It's like asking, why did God create the world? Well, he created the world in 6 days, according to the Genesis story. And then on the seventh day, didn't continue creating the world. He stopped and enjoyed the thing that he had made and looked at it and declared it very good. So the point of work is not more work. The point of work is leisure, enjoyment, wonder, sheer reveling in goodness, truth, and beauty. That's the end goal, if we need to talk about goals at all.
Because beauty and wonder only comes as a result of putting the work into it. So if you're just looking for a utilitarian, it's like that. Well, do we have to study this for the exam question? That's not the point.
C.S. Lewis would say absolutely to that point you just made, that the whole idea of examinations, at least at Oxford University, is relatively modern. Oxford's been around since the 13th century, so there are several centuries of history on which to draw. Lewis was very much of the view that examinations don't really necessarily tell you very much about the quality of a student's mind. They just tell you how well that student has been drilled to answer the questions that might crop up in the exam. It's like IQ tests. Do they really tell you how intelligent a person is, or do they just tell you how well they can pass IQ tests?
How good their memory is.
Yeah. And for that same reason, Lewis belonged to a generation of university professors who were very skeptical of postgraduate study. Lewis, like Tolkien, never did a doctoral degree. I mean, he got some honorary doctorates, but he never did anything beyond his 2 undergraduate degrees, first in classics and then in English. It was rather sort of infra dig in those days to do graduate study. Lewis referred to them as research beetles. And he thought it was a terrible sort of contraction of one's horizons, just at that age, in your early and mid-20s, probably, when the whole world should be opening before you and your horizons expanding. If at that point you have to focus in on one particular question about one narrow section of one particular element in the life of learning, you end up learning more and more about less and less, when really you should be becoming a sort of panoptically capable reader and scholar, interested in everything and knowing something about everything. It's the ideal, of course, is the Renaissance man, as personified by Leonardo da Vinci, because back then, someone like Leonardo could almost claim to know a lot about everything. But in our increasingly specialized worlds, that idea of the sort of Olympian mastery of all branches of learning has disappeared. But Lewis and Tolkien were trying to hold the line against that attitude.
Yeah, so it has changed. Interesting. We could park and go down there, but I need to bring it back to some other aspects that a homeschool parent, usually the mum, can gather up when they're preparing for using the Narnia series. So astrology and astronomy, what would you suggest they go and either buy or get from the library?
If it's not too egotistical to mention my own books.
Not at all. Go for it.
I mentioned Planet Narnia, which is my sort of scholarly and detailed account of the Narnia Chronicles. And that hopefully will be of use and of interest to mums and homeschool teachers. But for the children themselves, it would be far too complicated and detailed. So I've written a shorter version of Planet Narnia, which is called the Narnia Code. And that's much more accessible, popular, short chapters, short words, short sentences, very few footnotes. And that gives you a brief sort of overview of things like astronomy as it was understood in the Middle Ages, and indeed astrology, and why especially Christian students, Christian teachers, needn't be afraid of or alarmed by that word astrology, because a lot of Christians react against it very violently. I think, oh, astrology, that's an un-Christian, that's occultic, that's pagan. How can a Christian be interested in astrology? But of course, astrology just literally means study of the stars. You have biology, a study of life. You have geology, study of the earth. And astrology is studying the stars. Why shouldn't you study the stars? They're an aspect of God's creation. The only problem with astrology is that it can lead you into either a kind of idolatry, worshipping the stars at the sort of at the limit, or a kind of folly if you begin to believe that the stars are controlling you and determining you and giving you an inescapable predetermined destiny because you were born under a bad star. That's also an unchristian way of looking at the heavens. And C.S. Lewis also talks about how in the Middle Ages, the church resisted what he calls the politically undesirable practice of astrologically grounded predictions. When the court astrologer would come to the king and say, the stars foretell success if you go into battle next week with the French, and all the time he's in the pay of the French, and he's just making a quick buck on the side. So that lucrative and politically undesirable practice is another thing that the church stood out against. But the whole idea of the stars being significant, worth studying, has actually a very strong biblical root. In the book of Genesis, we're told that the stars are created for signs and for seasons. There are the two great lights, the sun and the moon, but also the stars. And the stars in their courses are fighting against Sisera, according to the book of Judges. There's the idea there that the stars do sort of have some kind of role to play in human affairs. It's rather mysterious exactly what that means, but that's a line that Lewis quotes in one of his books. Lewis loved Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. There the stars are conceived of as sort of angels, perpetually singing God's praises. And then when you come to the New Testament, you find at the start of Matthew's Gospel, the wise men coming from the East, because they've seen a star and it's leading them to the birthplace of Christ. But those wise men from the East, the Magi, are clearly astrologers, Babylonian astrologers probably, and their astrology leads them to worship Christ. And then come right to the end of the Bible and the book of Revelation, you have that picture in the apocalypse of the Son of Man holding the 7 stars in his right hand. As with so much imagery in the book of Revelation, that can be interpreted a number of ways. One way is to suggest that it's a way of depicting Christ's lordship over history, because it's from the seven planets that we take the names of the days of the week. And so to show the Son of Man holding them in his right hand is a way of indicating that Jesus is Lord of time, and he has all our days, all our futures, all our life trajectories in his grasp. So for those and many other reasons, there's a long tradition of good and godly Christian astrology. And it's that Lewis is sort of plugging into. He's not recommending in any sense, those foolish and stupid horoscopes in the back pages of magazines about, this Wednesday you will meet a handsome stranger, blah, blah, blah. That's all nonsense. It's a noble art. It's a noble science, properly understood. But the trouble is that in the last several centuries, and he talks about this in his book on the 16th century, astrology and astronomy have become separated. They were originally sort of entangled with each other. Astronomy has become a hard-headed and respectable science, and astrology has devolved into this sort of nonsensical superstition. But back in the 16th century, that unfortunate bifurcation hadn't occurred, and they were still woven in with each other, as it were, and the people who are asking what we now call astronomical questions about, the hard-headed questions about what is a planet made of and exactly where is it in the sky and how quickly does it move. Those people were the same sorts of people who were asking what we now call astrological questions, which are, what does this planet signify? Who was it made by? Who was it made for? What does it represent in terms of, spiritual symbolism? And that was a much healthier situation, Lewis suggests, when the two disciplines were effectively one. And again, it comes back to our earlier point about increasing specialization. in some ways brings clarity and focus to the life of learning, but in another sense, it brings a kind of narrowness and isolation to the life of learning.
I'm pleased you've spent a bit of time clarifying that. It was on my list of things to ask you. When I was younger, I was fascinated with the idea that there was some sense of being able to foretell or some influence or something. It was there in the scriptures and it was there for a reason, but I could never get a satisfactory answer out of it. So I just left it. But it seemed to me that somewhere along the line, the church had lost some body of work, that there's this gap. And I still just didn't know what to do with this, because you're quite right, especially in the evangelical churches, just anything to do with horoscopes, that's just evil, and you stay away from it. But that wasn't quite a sufficient enough answer for me. I did see, and I really enjoyed what you had written in the back of Planet Narnia, where you were discussing this. It was so helpful. And then I also see you've got a lot of references in the back of there too, and quotes and more things that curious people can go and do some due diligence themselves. I don't know that we're ever going to fill that empty space within the theological realm. I just don't know, but I'm eager to dot little bits around for my own understanding. And I hope other families do too, because there's something to be said, but I just don't know what it is.
It's a very interesting question, isn't it? What relationship we ought to have, or in fact do have, with the planets and the stars. In modernity, our 21st century life, which is so unnecessarily filled much of the time with electronic devices, we're separated from the natural world in ways which our forebears would not have been. And so now we don't know the stars like our ancestors did. You're lucky if you can find a person who can identify Venus or Orion or Cassiopeia or the Plough. But anything beyond that is beyond most people, whereas in the past you could navigate by the stars, and that was not an unusual thing to be able to do. And it was partly, of course, because when night fell, you weren't able to retreat into your warm, well-lit house and watch Netflix until 2 a.m. Either you went to bed or you stayed up, and if you had anything to look at, you looked at the stars, and so you naturally spend a great deal more time contemplating what they might mean, and indeed reveling in their wonder and their beauty. And now, especially those of us who live in cities and towns, we can't even see the stars because of light pollution.
We have the Southern Cross down where we are, and on a good night you can see it. And if you do go out, like you say, out of the cities, and we have gone out and taken mattresses and just lain there for ages and just watch, and the more you watch, the more you see. It's incredible. And I think our modern life has made us more ignorant of what our forebears just knew. To have a knowledge that C.S. Lewis had, he couldn't write what he did, not just Narnia, but his whole library's worth of work, without having an incredible education himself. His literary outcome is very much an indication of his entire educational life, probably with his mother and father also. With that in mind, literature, classical studies, history, how would you advise home educating parents to drill down well on this?
Interestingly, C.S. Lewis, you mentioned his mother and his father, who obviously taught him a good deal in his early years, really up until I think he was 9. I think he was more or less educated at home and then went to 4 schools, he said, and he learnt nothing at 3 of them. He had a very low view of his own educational experiences. And then he was privately tutored 2 years, I think, basically, before he went up to Oxford. And that experience of private tuition from a man called William Kirkpatrick, who Lewis nicknames the Great Knot, that was a really formative experience in Lewis's life. And it was basically, most of the time, at least in those 2 years, it was one-to-one tuition in Kirkpatrick's home. And the only other person there most of the time was Kirkpatrick's wife. So it was a very solitary experience for Lewis, but he loved it. He thrived on it. One of the interesting things about it, before I come back to your question, is that Kirkpatrick was an atheist, and yet he didn't manage to make C.S. Lewis permanently an atheist. because Kirkpatrick had such a love of reason and truth, and the desire to follow the argument wherever it led, that he imbued into Lewis. That stood Lewis in very good stead later when he was finding his way back to faith. But as for the question of drilling down into particularities, all I would say is, again, drawing upon C.S. Lewis and his advice, his observations about education, he says in one place that you should try to make your educational systems, your educational programs, syllabi, curricula, as good as you can, and they matter a lot. But then he also enters a note of humility and provisionality about it. Let me quote you one place where he says the educational machine, he's talking here more about schools than homeschooling, but it might have an application to homeschooling. He says the educational machine seizes the pupil very early and organizes his whole life to the exclusion of all unsuperintended solitude or leisure, the hours of unsponsored, uninspected, perhaps even forbidden reading, the ramblings and the long, long thoughts in which those of luckier generations first discovered literature and nature and themselves are a thing of the past. If a Traherne or a Wordsworth were born today, he would be cured before he was 12. And that, I think, that reflects Lewis's own happy experience of all those long ramblings and the long, long thoughts that he was able to think under the tuition of Kirkpatrick. And of course, most people aren't going to be able to afford private tuition. So you've got to factor that into the situation. But nonetheless, it's a point that I think parents, guardians, educators would do well to dwell on, especially if they are, very keen to arrive at some particular predetermined outcome of the education. And that's another point about Lewis's attitude to teaching, that he says somewhere that parents are not providence. Their bad intentions may be frustrated even as their good ones are. While we're planning the education of the future, we should be rid of the illusion that we shall ever replace destiny. Make your plans as good as you can, of course, but be sure that the deep and final effect on every single child will be something you never envisaged and will spring from little free movements in your machine which neither your blueprint nor your working model gave any hint of. In other words, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And even if your horse does drink, you can't get the horse to drink precisely the amount that you want it to, or from the cleanest bits of the river. In other words, children are their own people, and they're not machines to be programmed. They are free individuals and creatures of God like you and I are, who need to be respected and liberated into the goodness, truth, and beauty that awaits them just as much as it awaits us.
And that's the atmosphere that most homeschooling families are trying to cultivate. There are some who just create like a little mini school at home, but mostly the circles in which I moved, and certainly the Charlotte Mason principles, were that you were trying to teach a child how to think, not what to think. And to create the atmosphere in the home of the wanting to learn. So when I said a homeschooling family can curate the curricula for their children without compromising on any of the basics, and nobody knows a child as well as their parents, and they can see where their preferences, their giftings, their natural interests are, and they can release a child for hours at a time, should it be the right thing to do at the time, in order for that child to just immerse in something. They have that kind of freedom. That's the environment that I've got in mind. And when I think of your own story, two things about your story, actually. I love the story that you said. It was a very quick one, how you and your brothers would climb into bed with mum, and how that was one of your earliest memories and a really important one. But a story like that just warms a homeschooling mother's heart over and over, because at the time, Mum didn't know that you were going to become a world-renowned scholar on C.S. Lewis. That wasn't the purpose. But it's a wonderful story, doing what a mother should do, pouring into her children like that, in faith, not being able to see the outcome. And the other thing that I'm thinking about your experience is that you stumbled, if you like, and you uncovered this glorious secret that Lewis had written into the books. And when you were explaining that in your book, I suddenly thought, how did you know to see this? What was it about your own experience in education where you had the mental capacity that you weren't in a box? You kept going and asking the next question and asking the next question. You were asking the how, the why, not, oh, no, that can't be. Your brain just kept going there. Did you have any Socratic input in your education at all?
Not terribly much, no. I mean, my own education was very ordinary for the first 18 years of my life. I went to what Americans would call public schools, what we call state schools, and not terribly good schools at that, especially the one I was at between 11 and 16. I mean, I was fortunate enough in the top class because I was bright and hardworking, and so the top class tended to get the better teachers, it must be said. So I didn't get the fag end of that school. It was really only when I came as an undergraduate to Oxford and began to have one-to-one tuition. That's the great unique selling point of Oxford and indeed Cambridge, that you still get single or sometimes double tutorials once a week with your tutor. And I had one particular tutor who taught me more than anybody else, and he probably taught me more than anything else about just what you were talking of, asking the next question, not settling for the obvious answer, but pressing into a work. His name was Julian Thompson, Dr. Julian Thompson. He's just retired, actually. I went to his retirement dinner last summer. I remember thinking, even while I was studying under him, that I liked the way his mind worked. I didn't always necessarily agree with him or like his conclusions, but I thought this man's mental activity is impressive. He's always searching and looking for connections, and so I think if I did acquire any of that ability, it was probably from Julian more than anybody else. And indeed, well, also, I mean, it must be said, I mean, reading C.S. Lewis is an education in its own right. And so from an early age, I was reading Lewis, and Lewis's own attitude to the life of the mind. I mean, we've talked a little bit about it, the wonder, the liberality, the humility, the recognition that there's always a providential oversight. All those elements encourage you to consider that the life of the mind is one that's enjoyable. It's a good thing to love the Lord your God with all your mind, as well as with your heart, soul, and strength. Lewis has this great ability, I think, of showing that theological inquiry, historical inquiry, literary inquiry, psychological inquiry, it's all a great quest. It's fun. And if ever you lose that, that's the day you should pack up and stop teaching.
All right. Well, Mere Christianity and Abolition of Man, and I can see there's definitely some crossover in there. And obviously the abolition is probably best for senior high school students who are willing and able to really get into it and try and digest it. I'm going to follow up your book that you wrote for that as a guide, because when I was listening to the audiobook of Abolition of Man, I was going, what's he talking about? Help! I need some help. So I think that would also be a very good book to have on hand for an able-minded, curious, confident older student too. So let's say we're going to include Mere Christianity and Abolition of Man as some basic texts in a homeschooling opportunity. Do you want to add anything or recommendations to the family putting that together?
Well, certainly, as you've basically just said, leave The Abolition of Man till last, because it is a difficult book. And it certainly makes sense to, if you're going to look at Mere Christianity and The Abolition of Man, to look at Mere Christianity first. Because Mere Christianity, especially the first book of Mere Christianity, it comes in 4 sections. The first book of the book as a whole is like a popular version of The Abolition of Man. Mere Christianity starts out with a section called Right and Wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. Mere Christianity is based on short radio broadcasts that Lewis gave over the BBC during the Second World War. 15-minute talks. He didn't know who was going to be tuning in. He had to keep everything very general and accessible. But in that first section of Mere Christianity, he's basically advancing the same case about objective value as he advances much more philosophically and professionally in The Abolition of Man. So if you find The Abolition of Man difficult, as most people do, as I certainly do, a good way to limber up for it is by reading and rereading Book 1 of Mere Christianity. The best guide to Mere Christianity, I think, is the one called A Biography of Mere Christianity. It's by George Marsden. It's a very thorough and readable account of the book and its strengths and possibly some of its weaknesses. I mean, it's not a perfect book. Very few books are perfect, but it is a classic and really well worth reading. Yeah, George Marsden is a great guide to Mere Christianity, and hopefully my book, After Humanity, is a useful guide to The Abolition of Man.
I believe it would be. Is there any other comment you'd like to make regarding using Lewis's books as teaching tools before I move on and ask you about vocation?
Well, coming back to Narnia, and indeed any of Lewis's other works of fiction that might be used, like Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, the Ransom Trilogy, Till We Have Faces, the main thing I would urge is to remember that these books are meant principally for pleasure. They're meant to be read and enjoyed, not dissected and analysed. They, of course, can be dissected and analysed, and you can get a lot of added benefit from dissecting and analysing them. I mean, as I'm a literary critic myself, I can hardly deny that that's a valuable thing to do. But it's important always to remember that it's only it's a secondary thing. The main thing is to enjoy the read. After you've done all your dissecting and analysing, pulling the text apart, as it were, it's always important, I think, to remember to sort of tie it all back together and forget everything you've just learned in your analysis and dissection, and then just plunge yourself back into the story and read it and enjoy it. Now, of course, on that second reading or subsequent reading, after you've done all your study, you will have a much better informed mind. You'll be able to pick up on all sorts of things. You'll have attuned your ear to all sorts of harmonies that you might have missed the first time around. So you will be getting much more out of it. You'll be putting more in, and therefore you'll be getting more out. To come back to the point about what is the use of literary criticism, that I suppose is the use. You learn to read more richly and intelligently. All the while, on those subsequent readings, the main thing is just to let yourself be swept away by the story. I can't emphasize that too much.
So then, just to be clear, and so for the order, read the book just as it is, just enjoy the book. Second time through, now set about it with some study. Then go back and read it again and just watch it all come alive, and things that you didn't notice before, and the subsequent because they're very rereadable, aren't they?
Absolutely, yes, and rinse and repeat. And you can go on doing that almost indefinitely.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes. And finding something special each time.
Yes. Another thing to point out, this is a really useful, as a literary critic myself, I find great value in what C.S. Lewis talks about in his book, An Experiment in Criticism, where he says that all works of literature can be understood under two headings. They are something made and they are something said. And as something made, poema, to use the technical term, they're like a dance. They take you through a set of moves, or they're like a house with a particular structure. And you have to understand what it is that has been made. That's the first question you must ask of any work of the human mind, from a corkscrew to a cathedral, Lewis says. What is it? You wouldn't condemn a corkscrew for not being a good place to worship in. It's not trying to be a cathedral. And you wouldn't blame a cathedral for not opening your bottle of wine, but then it's not trying to be a corkscrew. So ask yourself what it is, the poema, something made. That's I think the first question to ask. Secondly, ask, what is it trying to say? What is its message? What is its purpose? Especially Christians, alas, tend to get that often back to front. They leap straight into what's it trying to say, and can I agree with what it's trying to say? And if I can't agree with what it's trying to say, then I better not read it, had I? That's very foreign to Lewis's attitude. He liked all kinds of literature. He had a voracious, almost omnivorous appetite for literature. And was prepared also to read a lot of things that he disagreed with violently and sometimes thought were very bad in some respects. Of course, it was his job to do so, and not everybody is called to that kind of vocation. But don't leap straight into the what's the message? What's the logos? To use his term, it comes back to the earlier point about the liberal attitude, the liberal-minded approach. Just enjoy the book and understand the book in its own right and in its own sense and in its own context. And then when you're informed on those matters, you will be able to understand the thing it's trying to say much better.
It's important for homeschooling mums to hear this, that it's okay to teach your child not to be afraid of something that you may not agree with. How do you equip the child to deal with it is...
Yes, absolutely. One of the reasons why Lewis became such a learned and literary person was because his parents had lots of books in the house. And Lewis talks about this in his autobiography. He says, let me just quote you a few lines. He said, they had books of all kinds, reflecting every transient stage of my parents' interests. Books readable and unreadable, books suitable for a child, and books most emphatically not. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy afternoons, I took volume after volume from the shelves. I had always the same certainty of finding a book that was new to me as a man who walks into a field has of finding a new blade of grass. The thing that sticks out to me from that is that Lewis admits that there were books emphatically not suitable for him, and yet nothing was forbidden him. And I think that's an important message, just to be hopefully not contrary or harsh on the homeschooling movement. But one critique that sometimes is brought against the homeschooling movement is that it's a retreat. It's frightened of the mainstream schooling. I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is a critique that can be made. And the attitude is, oh, well, if we send our children into the state schools, public schools, they'll be corrupted. And that may be true. I'm not saying I'm coming down one side or the other, but in reaction to that fear, that possibly very well justified fear, the opposite motive can kick in, and you can begin to think, I must protect the child at all costs from anything that might do it any harm, morally or intellectually or philosophically. But you can't, because this world is a dangerous place, and the child has to take its falls and graze its knees intellectually as well as physically. And we all know the story, the terrible example of the convent schoolgirl who, once she's freed from her convent school, she goes off the rails terribly because she's never been exposed to any temptation before. And as soon as she is exposed, she just is swept away completely because she's never learned any resistance. She's not developed her immunity. So that's a really important aspect of education, that you must expose the children to things that are dangerous, risky, wrong, and equip them to learn how to see through these dangers and strengthen their moral fiber so that they can, once they leave your charge, cope in this dangerous and dark world.
And it's always interesting to hear what others' perceptions are of homeschooling. And there would definitely be those that I would say, that family was a closeted family. But it is a wise parent who doesn't do either of the end extremes. It's a foolish parent that just allows their child to go into the state system and take no notice of the cultural Marxist doctrines that are currently being poured into these poor child's minds. So what's your alternative? Do you delegate? Do you take responsibility? And if you do, what are you going to do then? So just as a very quick explanation to you, last year I did a series on the system is failing our children. Okay, so what are the options? Do you stay in the school system? And we also call it the government schools in New Zealand are just called public schools. So if you're knowledgeable about that, how are you going to mitigate it? Because you could stay. Many jump and go to faith-based schools or private schools. You have the option of starting your own school. That's not a common one. Or you have the option of homeschooling. And that's when my speciality could kick in. So my job is not to convince everybody that homeschooling is the answer. It's not. And then if you're going to homeschooling, there's no one right way to do it. You don't have to do it forever. You could do it just for a term. And then, so basically what we're getting back to is the wisdom of the parents to make very good decisions for their children in order to equip them to live the life. That's the goal. All right. So something I ask my interviewees right at the end is that if you could time travel and go backwards a few years or to the beginning of your educational life, is there anything you would change?
Not that I would have had the power to effect this change, but just thinking of all conceivable possibilities that might have worked out had my life been different. One thing I would have liked to have been different is that I should have received a much better classical education. It wasn't until I was sixth form college that I got any opportunity to learn Latin. And even then, it was entirely voluntary. I just chose to do a Latin course for 1 year, which is pretty pathetic. Didn't equip me very well, but at least it broke me in, as it were, and turned out to be very useful indeed for when I came to Oxford to study Anglo-Saxon, which is part of, or was part of the English course here at Oxford, because at least I had a proper training in grammar. Because although I'd learnt a bit of French and German at school, not with all the Latinate, declensions and conjugations and all the rest of it that you learn in a proper Latin grammar. And then when I started studying biblical Greek, Anglo-Saxon, and then back my Latin training stood me in good stead for learning Greek. But if only I could have been drilled in Latin from the age of 5 onwards, so that it got into my bones, that would have been such a blessing. It would have equipped me so well for all sorts of things that I still struggle at. I mean, perhaps I wouldn't have liked it at the time, but so what? There's a lot of things that you don't like when you're young. I remember I learnt the piano and I never understood why I had to practice my scales. But eventually, after you buckle down and do your due diligence and your obedience to your tutor, your teacher, eventually you think, oh yes, this is why I've spent all those hours learning my scales, because it teaches you regularity of touch and speed and nimbleness and all the rest of it. So anyway, to answer your question, I wish I'd been taught Latin early.
Okay, which in itself is good advice. Yeah. Is there anything else you would like to share, Michael?
Well, let me just applaud all the people who do homeschooling, because I mean, despite that one little critique that I entered as a possible consideration, I am very much in favor of homeschooling, and people I know who have been homeschooled often, to my mind, strike me as particularly well educated and evincing just these qualities that we've been talking about wonder and flexibility and sheer quality of mind, which I particularly have seen in because I'm a visiting professor at Hillsdale College in Michigan, and a lot of Hillsdale students have been homeschooled. Engaging with them, I've often been struck by these educational fruit that they bear, and that they hardly realize that they're bearing, because you don't necessarily know how well you've been educated. You just receive what you're given, don't you? And like you just said, it's only when you look back that you realize the deficiencies, and sometimes also realize the great strengths of your education. If homeschooling is what you're called to do it with all your might. It's a great thing, and yeah, and it does offset and escape some of the terrible influences that are at work in state schools, public schools. And C.S. Lewis, I think, is a prime example of just that. As I said, he went to 4 schools and learnt nothing at 3 of them, and then it was only when he was basically homeschooled that he began to thrive.
And that sounds like we're getting just back to where we started from, which is probably a good place to finish. Thank you for your time, Michael. Listeners and the homeschool people are just going to be so grateful and helped immensely. You've given us a lot to think about, and we're really grateful for it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Christine. Thank you very much for having me.
The Narnia series seems a simple set of children's storybooks, but as we've seen, there's so much more. The ripples of possibilities will give you so many options. The trickiest part is choosing when to stop. You have at least 1 term's worth of bookwork at your disposal, and certainly longer should you want to. I would think a term would be more of an introduction only to the areas of study, because once the portals open, you'll see the potential. And can I ask a favour of you, please? Pass this episode on to anyone who appreciates C.S. Lewis and especially the Narnia Chronicles, because they're going to really enjoy it. Thank you so much.